When creating a research paper, we all need a methodology. That will help us to describe why we are doing our research the way we are doing it. And explaining our approach allows people, the future researchers and respondents and the panelists, why we chose to conduct that research in a specific manner. And of course, to obtain your data and to prove your hypothesis, we all need a tool. Hi, I am Bree and I am one of the facilitators that will talk about research methodology, and we will tackle one of the most important elements that can be found in your research methodology, and that is research instruments. But what is research instruments? The research instruments can refer to any tool that you may use to collect or obtain data, measure data, and analyze data that is relevant to your study or to your research. A research instrument can be used in social sciences and health sciences, but this tool can also be found within education that relates to the patients, staff, teachers, and even us students. The format of research instruments may consist of questionnaires, simple tests, checklists, scales, interviews, observation, and case studies. The choice of which specific instrument or research instrument tool that will be used in your study will be decided on by the researcher, but it should be strongly related rather to the actual method that will be used on your specific study. To assure the strength of your study, it is important to use previously validated instruments because these instruments will help you to gather your data quick for your particular research topic. Some common instruments are used in a quantitative research such as tests, performance-based tests, or questionnaires, interviews, and observation. However, interviews and observation are more often used in a qualitative research, but they can be still employed in a quantitative studies or research as long as the required responses or the analyzed data are numerical. When using instruments that are prone to subjectivity such as interviews, observations, and assessment of performance tasks, we have to consider to have a coder or evaluator because they will help us to gather and analyze our data. This is to improve your validity and reliability of your data. Now, what are the several aspects that we have to consider in describing our research instruments? First, the actual instrument used. Second, the purpose of the instrument. Third, the developer of the instrument. It may be an institution or other researchers. Fourth, the number of items or sections in the instruments. Fifth, the response format used. It might be multiple choice or yes or no. Sixth is the scoring of the responses. And seventh, the reliability and validity of the study. There are three ways in describing an instrument for your quantitative research. First is adopting an instrument. This means you will utilize an instrument that was used by the well-known institutions or reputable studies or publications. Some of the popular sources of instruments include the professional journals and websites, such as Test in Prints or the IRIS Digital Repository. Now, adopting an instrument means you do not have to spend so much time on establishing its validity and reliability, since they have already been tested by its developers and the other researchers. Sometimes, however, the available test does not generate the exact or the accurate data that you want to obtain. So in this case, you may modify the existing instrument or you may create your instrument. But as you develop an instrument, be guided by the instrument used in the studies that are similar to yours. Third, make sure that the items contained in your research instrument are aligned to your research questions and objectives. Remember that inadequacies in your research instrument will yield inaccurate data, thereby making the results of your study questionable. One of the action research tool is a case study. But what is a case study? A case study is usually an in-depth description of the process, experience, or structure at a single institution. This is to answer the combination of what and why's question. Case studies generally involve a mix of quantitative data collection techniques, such as interviews, focus group discussion, and extent document analysis. Most often, the researcher will analyze quantitative data first and then will use qualitative strategies to look into the deeper meaning of the trends identified in numerical data. Let's take, for example, if you are using a case study research instrument in your case study, then an example topic is an impact of increasing levels of multiculturalism on marketing practices, a case study of McDonald's Indonesia. Or a case that a group of individuals might be watched over an extended period to observe the progression of a particular disease. Have you all watched the Netflix series which called All of Us Are Dead? That is one of the examples, or that is one example of a case study research, wherein the science professor is trying to observe the mutation of the virus or the disease that he created. Next is checklist. Checklist structure a person's observation or evaluation of performance or artifact. They can be simple lists of criteria that can be marked as present or absent, or can provide space for observer comments. These tools can provide consistency over time or between observers. Checklists can also be used to evaluate databases, virtual IM services, the use of the library spaces or the books in XU, or even structuring peer observation of the instruction sessions. Now, this is an example of checklists that you may use to obtain your data in your research study. Checklist and rating scale type of question make the bulk of quantitative surveys, as it helps in simplifying and quantifying the attitude or behaviors of the respondents. Third is questionnaire. Questionnaire is a paper-based or electronic tool for collecting information about a particular research interest. It is a list of questions or indicators that the participants need to answer. In a quantitative study, a questionnaire typically uses a scale, and one of the examples of this is a Likert scale. It uses ratings to indicate participants' level of agreement with specific statements. And another approach in questionnaires is the conversion of responses into numerical values. An example of this is when terms denoting frequency such as always, frequently, sometimes, seldom, and rarely are converted into numbers of 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. A questionnaire can be semi-structured, structured, or unstructured questionnaire. When we say structured questionnaire, this means it uses close-ended questions or indicators. On the other hand, an unstructured questionnaire allows the participants to respond to the open-ended questions. Meanwhile, a semi-structured have both the characteristics of a structured and unstructured questionnaire, because they compose both the closed and open-ended question. But among these three, the structured type questionnaire is frequently used in a quantitative studies because it is easier to standardize as well as to code and interpret objectively. But it is important to note that a questionnaire is different from a survey. While a questionnaire refers to an instrument of data collection that contains a list of ready-made questions, a survey refers to a process of collection, recording, and analyzing data. A survey also encompasses various aspects of the research process, such as research design, instrument, construction, and sampling. It is thus a traditional way of conducting a descriptive research. There are guidelines of using questionnaire in your data collection. You as a researcher have to decide on the method of administering your questionnaires. Will you do it face-to-face or will you do it online? Use the face-to-face method if you need to capture the nonverbal cues spontaneously displayed by your participants, as well as their emotions and behavior. This method also includes administering questionnaires through video chat or conferencing. The online method, on the other hand, involves the administering of questionnaires through filling out web-based forms. The online method can be used if you do not need to take note of the behavior and the other nonverbal cues conveyed by your participants while answering your questionnaires. Next action and research tool is test. Tests are a quantitative research instrument used mainly focused on assessing a various skills and types of behaviors as well as describing a certain characteristics. Two of the main types of tests employed in a quantitative studies are standardized tests and non-standardized tests. Standardized tests are scored uniformly across different areas and groups. They are used by the official institutions to assess a wide range of groups such as students or test takers. When we say non-standardized, they are administered to specific sets of people, thus they may not be scored uniformly across different areas and groups. Standardized tests are often considered more reliable and valid. However, non-standardized tests may be more appropriate for obtaining certain responses, or measuring a specific skill. Two of the most common examples of tests are achievement tests and aptitude tests. An achievement test is a standardized test which measures the extent of the skills and the knowledge that a person has acquired after a considerable period of time. An example is the NAT or the National Achievement Test administered by the Department of Education. And a NAT or the National Achievement Test measures how much students have learned in a specific subject areas after a long period of time. Aptitude test assesses one's skills and knowledge to predict one's ability to perform a certain kind of work. One example is the school entrance examination. These examinations are used for finding out if the test takers have sufficient knowledge and skills to excel in the academic institutions. The type of tests and questions that you will utilize in your data collection will depend on the kind of information that you would like to obtain as a researcher. For instance, tests using multiple choice questions measure a wider range of learning outcomes and skills in a relatively short period of time, use objective scoring and reduce guessing, and are amenable to item analysis. Measuring actual skills, meanwhile, requires the use of performance-based tests. The next action research tool is interview or interviews. Interviews are conducted with a sample from a population, and the key characteristic they exhibit is their conversational tone. A quantitative interview is a method of collecting data about an individual's behavior, opinion, values, emotions, and demographic characteristics using numerical data. It involves the oral exchange of information between the researcher and the subject, either face-to-face or not. How can we differentiate quantitative interviews from qualitative interviews? Quantitative interviews are highly different from other types of interviews which are used typically in qualitative research. Qualitative interviews mostly obtain open-ended questions. On the other hand, quantitative interviews tend to be highly close-ended, although few open-ended questions can also be asked. Quantitative interviews must be accompanied by a rating scale or a rubric, and the responses must be numerical in nature. Moreover, qualitative interviews tend to involve data from a small sample size, while a quantitative interview aims to gather data from a large sample size. Lastly, quantitative interviews tend to minimize the interviewer effect, which means that the responses of the participants may be affected by the behavior displayed by the researcher or the manner that the questions are presented. Due to these reasons, the structured type of interview is the most applicable to quantitative research. Unstructured, semi-structured, informal interviews, and focus group discussion are used in a qualitative research. Now, what are the different types of interview research instrument? The general format of an interview is when the interviewer asks their interviewee to answer a set of questions that are normally asked and answered verbally. Yet, there are several different types of interview research instruments that may exist. First is a structural interview. It may be used in which there are a specific number of questions that are formally asked of the interviewee and their responses recorded using a systematic and standard methodology. Second is the unstructured interview. May still be based on the same general theme of questions, but here the person asking the question, the interviewer, may change the order the questions are asked and the specific way in which they're asked. Third is the focus interview. is one of which the interviewer will adapt their line or content of questioning based on the responses from the interviewee. Fourth is the focus group interview or the focus group discussion, in which a group of volunteers or interviewees are asked questions to understand their opinion or thoughts on a specific subject. And then lastly is a non-directive interview, which there are no specific questions agreed upon, but instead the format is open-ended and more reactionary in the discussion between the interviewer and the interviewee. Last but not the least is observation. Although observation is more frequently used in a qualitative research, it is also used in a quantitative research, particularly when the characteristics being observed is quantitative in nature. These characteristics includes the length, the width, the height, the volume, the area, the time, the speed, etc. In addition, observation is used in a quantitative research when assessing performances. In such instances, observers use a rubric or rating scale in the data collection. An observation may take different forms. First is controlled observation. It is typically used in experimental research. The researcher selects the time, the place, the participants, and the circumstances where the data collection will take place. This selection is usually done under a standard procedure. In this type of observation, the observer takes a non-participant role because he or she does not interact with the participants. And the procedure can be replicated and the data are easier to analyze. Lastly, this observation method is considered easier to implement due to its highly structured nature. Next is natural observation. It is carried out in a non-controlled setting. To a certain extent, the researcher does not control the circumstances but allows the nature flow of events to happen. Because of this, natural observation has greater ecological validity. Next is ecological validity. It refers to the flexibility of the findings to be generalized to real-life context. This also responds to the other areas of inquiry not originally intended by the researcher. Lastly is the participant observation. It allows the observer to become a member of the group or community that the participants belong to. This type of observation can be overt or covert. When the participant observation is done overtly, the participants know the research-related motives of their observation. But when the participant observation is performed covertly, the participants are not aware of the intention behind the observations. Now, what makes a good research instrument? A good research instrument is the one that has been validated and proven reliability. It should be one that collects data in a way that's appropriate to the research questions being asked. Your research instrument must be able to assist you in answering your research aims, objectives, and research questions, as well as to prove or disprove the hypothesis of your study. Lastly, it should not have any bias in the way that the data is collected, and it should be clear as to how the research instrument is used appropriately. Don't forget that the type of the research instrument will depend on the format of your research study being performed, whether it's qualitative, quantitative, or mixed methodology. Good luck!
If you found the one, you should never give her up. I think it's the way life changes when in love, yeah. I surround my soul with the positivity. That's why I don't worry.